people on.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Shana Wasserman, and I'm the Vice President of Communal Relations at J Street. Welcome to today's J Stream entitled Processing How the Jewish Community Talks to Each Other About Israel. We are streaming this important conversation on Facebook and will be archived on J Street's website. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Harry Reis, who's currently the Director of Policy and Strategy at New Israel Fund. He's a great partner and friend of J Street. Harry, take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. I know it's true for me and for all of you that the last few weeks of violent conflict, which have led to a devastating toll on both Israeli and Palestinian populations, have marked a new and awful chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm Harry Reis, Director of Policy and Strategy at the New Israel Fund, and it's my privilege to be moderating this discussion today with two of the most thoughtful and inspiring leaders, I think, in the American Jewish community today, Rabbi Sharon Brous and Nancy Kaufman, to help us navigate through some difficult topics. For those of us who care about the region and diverse communities who live there, this has been a painful time, with military escalation affecting communities in Gaza and across Israel, a time marked by civic unrest and police violence. We have seen not only in Jerusalem, but in Arab localities and mixed cities like Haifa and Lod, a truly shocking eruption of intercommunal violence. Many of you have had the opportunity to delve into these issues in other briefings with J Street, with NIF, other partners. Today, we're going to be going into a different and very specific facet of this conflict, the complex and challenging ways in which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict reverberates within our own Jewish communities and in the broader American conversation. Before we start, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the trauma and pain in this moment that can make it difficult for us to have open and vulnerable conversations about where we are. We're coming into this conversation from different places with different vantage points and life experiences, and that's okay. So with that, I want to start off the conversation with two people who I think could not be better equipped to hold that conversation in all of its challenging complexities, Sharon Brous and Nancy Kaufman. So this is how it's going to work. I am going to introduce our esteemed guest. I'll pose a few questions to Sharon and Nancy, and then I'll be fielding your questions throughout and ask them in the course of our conversation. So first, let me introduce our guests. Rabbi Sharon Brous is the senior and founding rabbi of IKAR and has devoted her rabbinate to reinvigorating Jewish tradition and practice and advancing soulful multi-faith justice work in Los Angeles and around the country. You may recognize Rabbi Brous from her 2016 TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, which has been viewed more than 1.4 million by 1.4 million people and translated into 22 languages. And in 2013, she had the honor of blessing President Obama and Vice President Biden at the inaugural National Prayer Service and returned in 2021 to bless President Biden and Vice President Harris. Nancy Kaufman has had a distinguished career as a leader in the Jewish community, serving as the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women and CJW, and previously as the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Boston for 20 years. In her volunteer life, Nancy was a founding member and serves on the board of Safety, Respect, Equity Network. She's the board chair of the New York Jewish Agenda, and she serves on the advisory boards of Integrity First for America and Combatants for Peace. Nancy was a founding steering committee member of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable and a board member and policy chair of the Urban League of Massachusetts. Thank you both for being with us today. Rabbi Brous, I want to start with you. I thought we could start off our conversation with a simple, but at this moment, weighty question. How are you doing in this moment?
First of all, thank you, Harry. It's really good to be with you, and Nancy. I'm honored to sit with you and be in this conversation with both of you. And I just wish we were sitting in a cafe in New York talking right now instead of on the screen. But I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to be together. And thank you to everybody who joined us this morning. I think this is a really important conversation. How am I doing? I just want to place for a moment this latest eruption of violence in the context of the raw open wound that we've all been experiencing, not only of the last 15 months before that, but also of the 5 years before that. And I think what's happening right now to the spirit is both a sense of exhaustion and overwhelm, and also perhaps the possibility of real movement and real growth. And we'll talk more about that this morning. But one of the things that I think a lot about is that we are part of the reason that we're so exhausted, that I'm so exhausted, and I think we all are, is that we're actually living in real time through an era of great moral awakening. And our rabbis teach that when a person is sick, you have to put the whole body on the table and do a real diagnosis in order to understand how to treat the illness. But too often we're too busy and we're too distracted, and we end up kind of putting band-aids on problems. And part of what's happening in this time, which was certainly accelerated by the 2016 election and Trump's presidency, is that people are really, for the first time, looking very seriously at not only what the surface wound looks like, but what's the deeper systemic problem at the heart of it. And there's a lot of truth telling that's happening in our time, and that's very painful, but I also believe it's the only way that healing is possible. So I am both, both drained and anguished, and also inspired and hopeful that this time of truth telling and reckoning could lead us, both here in the United States and in Israel and around the world, to a different kind of future.
Thank you, Sharon. I want to ask you, Nancy, the same question. And how are you doing in this moment? But also, what are you seeing? And maybe from your vantage point, maybe you could share with us some of your observations from your decades of Jewish communal service about how our communities are responding to and engaging with this recent conflict.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you to J Street, and always wonderful, Rabbi Sharon Brous, to be with you on the other coast. I am cautiously optimistic. I think, like Sharon, sometimes wounds have to be open and very raw in order for change to occur. And I think, I'm horrified by this latest war, but I hope that it showed quite vividly the no-win of a military solution, and that a military solution to the conflict, while we've said it over and over again, is just not viable. I also feel, as my dear friend Ruth Messenger said after the 2016 election, when we were all very depressed and a few of us were having dinner, and she said, "Nancy, despair is not a strategy." And I think that I have sort of tried to live by that following the 2016 debacle, and I live by that every day in terms of Israel, is that despair is not a strategy, and that if we fall into despair, which I'm sad to say I think too many of our community have, it will lead to either total disengagement by the member, not only the Jewish community, but the community at large, and there will be no change. And I think that, so that we have to, as a dyed in the wool community organizer, I believe you have to, organize, and it's not always easy. When I look at what happened this time, I think probably the deepest sense of sadness and fear that I had was what was happening in the mixed cities. I spent most of my 20 years in Boston, going back and forth to Haifa several times a year. It's our sister city, and have deep friends and connections, and always was very hopeful when I went to Haifa, because I always felt like, Haifa got it, and there were amazing relationships in terms of people working together. And to see, Haifa and Lud and the other places, what was happening within Israel between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel, to me was it wasn't surprising because I think most of us who observed this over the last 30 years knew that this was deteriorating, but it was striking. So having said that, the second part of your question, Harry, is what am I seeing? I see some change. It's maybe subtle, but I see some change. I mean, I think as a JCRC director, I spent much of the early days of being in Boston as always having to stand with the democratically elected government of Israel. That was the watchword, right? We stand with the democratically elected government of Israel. We don't live in Israel. We don't vote in Israel. Therefore, how can we talk about Israel? As time went on and I became more established, I was the first JCRC in the country that you may remember that allowed J Street to be around the table of the JCRC. Somehow we could have ZOA and we could have APAC and we could have camera, but somehow J Street and NIF but they were around our table and joined and we did it. So I see a change. I see, rather than quiet whispers of people saying the settlements really aren't good for the Jewish people, occupation isn't good for the Jewish people, I think people are beginning to say, it doesn't matter who's right. It doesn't matter, who did what to whom. What matters is that we have to live a moral and ethical life. And if we're going to live a moral and ethical life as Jews, we've got to do something about the situation. So, I can say more about that as we go on, but I saw some movement and I credit J Street, incredible credit to J Street for what they've done on the Hill. I mean, let's think about it. 20 years ago, there wasn't a presence, there weren't elected officials who could be pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. They were, they were labeled other things. So
well,
thank you. What to say, but
thank you both for opening up the conversation so soulfully. I want to shift the conversation a little bit, but I failed to mention what Shana just posted in the chat, that if you have a question, you can post it in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll be fielding questions throughout during the Q&A portion of our conversation. Sharon, I wanted to ask you if in this period you could describe what you see as the fault lines that are emerging in our community as it relates to Israel and Palestine. How would you describe these fault lines, and how do you feel that this most recent escalation in Gaza has exacerbated them?
So there are a couple of different ways to identify where the fault line lies. There's obviously the generational explanation, roughly speaking, which Peter Beinart, brought very significantly more than a decade ago, and I think has in some ways shaped our understanding of what's happening in the community. There's the religious fault line and the likelihood that people who identify as modern Orthodox or Orthodox will hold certain political perspectives and approaches to Israel, whereas those who don't, the non-Orthodox community, will generally hold different perspectives. But the way that I've been thinking about it, especially over the last couple of years, is that what's driving the massive rift in the American Jewish community is not just a kind of a political perspective, but something really much deeper that's going on in the Jewish psyche. I actually think that there's a split Jewish psyche that we're seeing manifest right now. So, and the way that I understand it is, in a couple of weeks, we're going to read the story of Bilam, who was hired to curse the Jewish people, and instead he goes up. This is in Sefer Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, and he goes up to the mountaintop and he gazes on the people Israel, and he says, "Am levadad yishkon." This is a people that dwells apart, that's not reckoned among the nations, in chapter 23 of the book of Numbers. And I think that this idea of Am levadad yishkon has become so central to Jewish self-definition and self-identity for many people. Jews are alone, separate, apart, isolated from the world, and coming to terms with that is absolutely essential to our survival. This is a kind of trauma response that the world ultimately will not defend us. We have to defend ourselves. You don't have any true friends in the world. And so we are dependent on our own strength. And it brings a kind of sense of constant vigilance. This is a survival mechanism for us, and in its extreme, it really blocks out empathy for other people, and compassion for other people. And it also, I think, it looks at compassion as weakness or even betrayal. And, you know, many of us have been on the receiving end of that critique, that even expressing compassion or an attempt to understand a Palestinian narrative is an act of, is a traitorous act. And I remember years ago, Rabbi Chaim Seidlerfeller shared this quote from Jabotinsky, where he says that when the Torah says that we should understand the heart of the stranger, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt, Jabotinsky writes, contemporary morality has no place for such childish humanism, right? When you're an Am Levadad Yishkon Jew, when that's the central guiding force of your mentality, there's no space for that kind of compassion. It's actually dangerous. It risks Jewish lives. So the second Jewish mentality, though, and what I see is on the other side of this fault line, is it's also trauma-based, but it's the idea that our trauma, our history, our inherited vulnerability, it leaves us more awake to other people's struggles, that we don't define ourselves by our victimhood leaving us closed, but instead open. And this is a kind of, I think of it as a lo tov hiyot adam levado mentality, that it's not good for a person to be alone. It's not good for a people to be alone in the world. And that the more vulnerable we feel for our own safety, the more critical it is that we deepen our relationships with others who are similarly vulnerable, that we double down on our work in racial justice, in working to make systemic change here in this country and beyond. And it's true that sometimes that mentality also manifests in an extreme way. And sometimes it leads some Jews to even abandon their own connection with their own people and their own history. Sometimes it makes Jews identify with anyone else, but not the Jewish story. But I think in its ideal form, what it does is it puts our vulnerability and our trauma in the broader context of human suffering. It turns us into allies with others who are similarly fighting for redemption and for liberation. And I think the challenge of this moment is actually identifying which of these psyches is the dominant one for us, and is there space for us to hold a little bit of both, but ultimately to be driven by a sense that our own vulnerability should lead us more deeply into the struggle for a just and loving society, both here in the United States and in the state of Israel. And so can we affirm our own anguish, our own fear, our own terror, and have that be a driver for us to build a more just society, instead of have that be a justification for retreat into the entrenched ideologies that have become so dominant, and even more dominant in this day, where we see these voices that used to be very much on the extreme, at least in Israeli society, now actively embraced and even elevated to roles in the Knesset. Can we find a way to allow our vulnerability to drive us more deeply into discourse about how together to build a just society?
Thank you, Rabbi Sharon, for that framework. I think that really, really resonates, and it links to the question I want to ask you, Nancy, which is about polarization. There's been a lot of talk about the effects of polarization in our own political environment, not just in Israel, but here in the United States. I'm curious, as you've been watching things unfold, how are you understanding that phenomena of polarization? Sorry, we're getting some feedback, affecting our own communal conversation over that issue.
Okay, so I want to build on what Sharon was saying. First of all, we need to look at the data. We need to look at the data, because the voices that have been the loudest have not necessarily been the voices that are the majority of the Jewish community. One of the reasons I took on with Matt Nossimchuk and others, Sharon Kleinbaum and Rachel Timmener, being part of the New York Jewish Agenda, is that we felt that, you know, here you have New York City, the largest Jewish community in the United States of America, and the majority of Jews' voices are not heard. They're not represented. Far left, far right, mainstream Jews are not represented in City Hall or in the State House, and certainly not represented in a two-part way when it comes to domestic and Israel. You know, many of my dear friends on the left have decided that they only want to focus on domestic. They don't want to focus on Israel. They don't want to talk about Israel. They don't want to raise anything about Israel. And, you know, folks on our right flank believe any of us who criticize Israel are, you know, self-hating Jews. I know that from firsthand experience. And I think that some of you might have seen, if not, I'd urge people to look it up, but Jerry Nadler, my congressman, had a op-ed in the New York Times that I thought was fabulous last week. And he said, Democrats have not abandoned Israel while maintaining strong support for a two-state solution and calling out the corrosive nature of the occupation for both peoples. So I think, we can be both and during the whole, issue of the Women's March, and when that was all playing out, even though I've since been accused of enabling anti-Semitism, which I find offensive and outrageous. But one of the things I felt so strongly about, and the reason I went and stood up and sat on a panel with Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory at Sundance, was so that I could say how it is that I carry the following identities. I am a pro-Israel, progressive, feminist activist who cares about the rights of Palestinians. To me, that is totally consistent with what it means to be Jewish. And we'll go back to the data and remind you of the Pew study that just came out. And of the top 3 things in the Pew study, first of all, it said that 71% of Jews identify as Democrats. Let's remember that. And number 2, it said of the 3 top connections, what's essential for Jewish identity, number 1, 76% said Holocaust and remembering the Holocaust. 72% said leading a moral and ethical life. And 59% said working for justice and dignity. Now, I would suggest that in the 72% who said that leading a moral and ethical life was essential to Jewish identity, that it is difficult to explain how we are leading a moral and ethical life if people don't have equal rights, whether they are here in the United States or in Israel. So that is like, so I really get upset when this gets identified as left and right, because to me, it's not a left-right problem. It's a problem of human dignity. It's a problem of what it means to be Jewish. It's a problem about our moral and ethical commitment to how we want to live our lives. And we've allowed the conflict in Israel to be sort of described and portrayed as either you're for and against. And let me close with what Sharon was saying. I come out of the community organizing, community relations tradition. Community relations, the whole point of community relations and why we have community relations is that because we are only 2% of the population of the United States, and if society isn't a good place for Jews, for everybody else, it's not going to be a good place for Jews, right? If we can't have a society that respects the dignity and humanity of the individual, whatever their ethnic, racial, or religious background, then we are not going to be able to have respect and dignity. And that was the whole philosophy behind community relations. It was why we didn't build bridges to other ethnic groups, because it was good for Israel. When my Black Presbyterian minister friend in Boston, who I had a relationship with around gang violence, came to speak at my annual meeting, and I said, and oh, by the way, the Presbyterians are going to be voting on divestment this summer. Do you think you could say something about that? It wasn't a quid pro quo. I didn't say he had to. He researched it, and he ended up denouncing Presbyterian divestment from Israel. Why? Because we had a relationship that was about, supporting one another and things we're concerned about. So this is doable if we only start from a place of respect and dignity and understanding that it's not all them, it's not all us. I mean, this latest conflict just says it all. I mean, it's horrible that 4,000 rockets landed on Israel. It's awful that our friends, were going into shelters. And yes, Israel has a right to defend itself for sure. But it's also horrible that, so many children were killed in Gaza. And it's not the New York Times fault that they showed all those pictures. And I'm not an anti-Semite if I believe in the dignity of all human beings.
Nancy, thank you for bringing that up and for sharing all of this, and especially diving into the data. I want to talk about the anti-Semitism question in a moment, but I want to pick up on another thread about dignity and equality that you just mentioned, and ask Sharon. We've just lived through a time period that's still ongoing, a year of civic engagement that was unprecedented and mobilization to acknowledge, confront, and dismantle white supremacy in the United States. I want to ask you, do you feel like this particular moment in time has changed the lens through which Jews are understanding the nature of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. How is the Black Lives Matter moment coming into this conversation?
Yeah, I think it has absolutely changed the conversation. And I will say that I believe what we just experienced this past month in Israel-Palestine is different from all the previous rounds of conflict and escalation. I think it's different in the way that the murder of George Floyd was different, in the sense that we have a long history of unarmed Black men who are killed by police officers. And this one last summer changed the conversation and forced from the margins to the mainstream a conversation about policing in America that simply wasn't happening in the mainstream. And I think in a similar way, what happened this past month is forcing a different kind of conversation. It's sort of where we started about this era of moral awakening. And I think that this is there in part because of the context of the rawness of COVID and the racial justice uprisings and the Trump administration. There's an openness, there's a different kind of awareness. There's a veil that's being lifted right now in many people's hearts and minds. And it is impossible and irresponsible to not apply the same lessons that we're learning here to the situation on the ground in Israel-Palestine. I think it would be reckless and irresponsible for us to continue with business as usual and keep pushing the same rigid defensive script that has been pushed regarding Israel in the American Jewish community for generations, given the newfound, now mainstreamed awareness that many of us have of the way that generations of racism and violence corrode a society at its heart. And there's a text that I think about all the time that for me has become a very formative text in the way that I've been looking at what's going on in the United States, which comes from Netivot Shalom, from the Slonim Rabbi, who taught just at the turn of he died in the just before the year 2000. And he wrote that when you build a home on a rotten foundation, cracks will inevitably begin to appear in the walls. And the homeowner, in desperation, because he's invested so much in building this beautiful home, will start to paint over those cracks. But the cracks will only deepen. And the homeowner will start to try to plaster over those cracks, but the cracks will continue to appear. And he says the only way that this homeowner stands a chance of the entire house not collapsing on him and taking down everyone who's inside is uprooting the house, cleaning out the foundation and building a new foundation that is safe and clean and healthy so that the home can be rebuilt in a way that is ultimately sustainable. And Netivot Shalom's talking about our Bait Ruchani, our spiritual home. He's saying you have to have the courage to actually look at what's going on. What's the spiritual heart of where's the toxicity in your system? But it's so clear to me that he's also talking about our actual home, our home in this country and our home over there, that he's saying when you build a nation on a foundation that is ultimately either toxic or rotten or built on cruelty or even barbarism, in either or both of these cases, and so many homes, not just Israel and the United States, but so many nations are built on these toxic foundations. It doesn't go away. And the only way to address it is to reckon with it. And so we're beginning to use that language in America here in mainstream spaces about what a reckoning would actually look like. The reporting on Tulsa in the course of the last several days has been absolutely transformative, right? And totally different from what we've seen in decades past. And I've heard from so many people, and I imagine that many of the people who are watching us right now would say, why didn't I learn about Tulsa growing up? Nobody ever told me about the Tulsa massacre. And now our kids know about the Tulsa massacre, and they should. This is part of uprooting and cleaning out the foundation. And it's not enough to just talk about it. It has to come with reparations. It has to come with real, honest conversations. It has to come with the transformation in the way that we talk and think about this. So too with Israel. It's impossible for us to go through, and as I said, reckless and irresponsible for us to go through that kind of moral awakening when it comes to the treatment of Indigenous people in the United States and Black and Brown people in the United States, when we come to a reckoning around slavery, around the era of Jim Crow and racial terror, around mass incarceration. We're learning about all of these things differently now in the US. How can we, it's not to say that we're going to map a conflict here on a conflict there and make assumptions that all of the dynamics are the same. They're not. But the moral awakening must be the same. This awareness that there's a story beneath the story. And if that story remains toxic and hidden, it will corrode the entirety of the beautiful home that we've struggled so much to build. And it's on all of us to do the work of cleaning out the foundation, of giving light to it, and making repair for it so that we collectively can build a different kind of future.
Thank you. I'm into that, first of all. Thank you for sharing that. I want to shift the conversation a little bit and ask you both a different kind of compound question. And it's a bit difficult. I'm seeing in the Q&A that some of the questions that are coming in actually are relating to this topic, but that question's this. In the last few weeks, we've seen an escalation of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, here in New York City and abroad, in the wake of the escalation of violence in Gaza and Israel. And at the same time, I think we're seeing a kind of contestation in the public sphere over what does and what does not constitute anti-Semitism, specifically as it relates to our discourse over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So my question is, how should we seek to understand this phenomenon of anti-Semitism in relation to the current escalation of violence, but the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how we talk about it?
Okay, so let me start and say amen to everything Sharon said. Thank you so much, because you say it so beautifully. My worst fantasy used to be to follow Barney Frank or Ted Kennedy on a panel, but I think following Sharon Brous is much worse than that. Okay, so let's be clear on this one. And I think it's very important, Harry, and I'm really glad you're asking it. Anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel are not one and the same. They're not one and the same. Anti-Semitism, according to the IRA definition, is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. According to IRA, it's rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish individuals and/or property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. That's the IRA definition. If you go to the recent Jerusalem Declaration, anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews. So I really want to be clear, because I am someone who feels very strongly, and I think we all do, about speaking out against anti-Semitism, and well, we should. It obviously gets conflated with anti-Israel. That's not to say that there are some people who are anti-Israel who may be anti-Semitic, but there are some people who are critical of Israel who certainly are not anti-Semitic. And I think we all know that who they are, and that there is a difference. And I think that what's tragic right now is that the criticism of the Israeli government, and this has been true, in our Jewish community for years. I mean, going back as long as I've been working in the Jewish community, which was 30 years, if you criticized Israel, you were either a self-hating Jew or you were anti-Semitic. Funny that we seem to be able to criticize our own government, and it's okay to criticize our own government. And strange that even, and really upsets me when people on my left flank won't go to Israel because of the policies of the government. I said, well, that would be like you won't live in the United States because of the policies of our government the last several years. I mean, I don't get it. The people of Israel are not one and the same with the government, nor are the people of the United States one and the same in our government, God forbid. So that just makes no sense to me. I think that, anti-Semitism coming off of this conflict, actual acts of anti-Semitism are purely wrong, need to be condemned, are outrageous, and quite frankly, are just an excuse for just anti-Semitic acts. Criticizing Israel whether you're Jewish or you're not Jewish, is something we do in a democracy, right? We criticize our government. We criticize our own government. We criticize the government of Israel. So I think they have to be separated. I think it is no coincidence that according to the ADL, the numbers of anti-Semitic incidents in the first year of the Trump administration skyrocketed from what it was before. And I think we know that most of the anti-Semitism, not all of it, most of it has been white supremacists, and most of it, you know, when they're coming for us, they're coming for other groups in our society, which is what Charlottesville certainly showed. So I will say to anyone who will listen that you know, when I asked this latest thing around this anti-Semitism, when I was told that I would enable anti-Semitism, and I was personally offended and angered by that. And that was coming not from the Zionist Organization of America, but from the Democratic majority Democratic Jewish majority in Israel. Really? Seriously? You know, when we start doing it to ourselves, then we really have a very, very serious problem. So I think those of us who've been leaders of the Jewish community, and I'll include myself, who didn't speak out soon enough about what we knew was wrong, now need to say, we have to help be part of the solution, not for them, but for us, for our own souls, right? I mean, my dear friend, Amnon Mitzner, when he was mayor of Haifa, I remember he said, we don't believe in two states because of the Palestinians. We believe in two states because of the soul of Israel is going to be rotted away if we don't do it. So to me, I'm really clear. We need to speak out against anti-Semitism. We need to combat anti-Semitism, and we need to differentiate between what is anti-Semitism and what is constructive criticism of Israel. And, you know, again, my work with New York Jewish Agenda, I'm very proud that we've actually been doing work on that would leave space for the Israel conversation while unambiguously naming anti-Semitism wherever it rears its ugly head. So,
thank you, Nancy. That I think was really, really helpful and a starting point. I want to ask Rabbi Sharon to address the same question, and maybe I just want to add a layer of particularly what Nancy began to get into about the contestations over what constitutes anti-Semitism and what doesn't. And we're seeing, you know, Nancy talked about personally being the target of an organized campaign to discredit her on the basis of fueling anti-Semitism, but that charge does not only affect Jews. We've seen it very potently weaponized to delegitimize critiques of Israel that are coming from progressive leaders, particularly leaders of color and particularly women of color who hold positions of leadership in Congress. So I wanna sort of see if we can delve into both the episodes of overt, sometimes violent rhetoric of anti-Semitism that comes up in this conflict, but also how we can navigate what is increasingly a contested discourse of anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. I think it's, first of all, Nancy, I just want to say I and so many others were really disgusted by what happened to you, by this, by really what was a smear, and terribly destructive, I think, to our whole community. And you've been such an iconic leader, and your voice is so critical in this space. And I think that I just want you to know that I from the West Coast over here, and many of us across the country, and I'm sure across the land, we're really upset about it. And I think that you are your voice is so essential in this conversation. And I thank you for the clarity with which you just shared all of this. My analysis is very similar to yours. I think that there are multiple forms or dominant threads of anti-Semitism that have manifested in America. I agree that the dominant thread over the course of the last 5 years, since before Trump was elected, but even during the campaign, which was stirred up and often emerges in the context of heightened racism in a society, is a kind of murderous, virulent, white supremacist, right-wing nationalist Jew hatred. And as Eric Ward has so powerfully illuminated for us over the years, over the last several years. This is a version of anti-Semitism that is at the beating heart of white nationalism, that is used as a way to explain away Black excellence, and it's offensive to Jews and offensive to Black people, and horrible. And I think that most of us didn't really understand it until the tiki torches and the Jews will not replace us, when the whole lot of us started saying, like, what's the connection between this, and how does that work? And so I think we've gotten a whole education on anti-Semitism in the last few years, just in trying to understand that. The second dominant thread, though, is some of what we've been seeing, which is anti-Semitism that really manifests in the context of opposition to Israel, which I believe comes from a kind of uninterrogated subterranean anti-Semitism, which, when something happens in Israel, whether it's the fighting that happened at the Gaza border, right at the moment that the embassy was being moved by the Trump administration to Jerusalem, or the conflict over the flare up over the last month, people's outrage over the conflict manifests in acts of anti-Semitism. I don't believe that what's happening there creates the anti-Semitic reaction. I think that there is a responsibility, just as we have been talking now for the last several years about how there is an obligation among every white person in America to interrogate internalized racism, and to read and learn about white fragility, and try to determine how our organizations can become anti-racist. I also believe that that work needs to be done in terms of interrogating anti-Semitism and trying to understand the ways in which there is a kind of under the surface anti-Semitic sentiment that periodically bursts through the surface, and people say, where did that actually come from? That anti-Semitism, when it manifests, often manifests in the context of the movement for Palestinian rights, which is used by those who have those anti-Semitic tendencies as a cover for their anti-Semitism. And I've heard now many Palestinians speak out against it because they feel like their movement is being used as a justification for anti-Semitism. So I agree with Nancy. Criticism of Israel as a state is not anti-Semitic. Equating all Jews or even equating all Israelis with the state of Israel, with the government of Israel, is anti-Semitic. And I think, Nancy, what you're saying is exactly right. When I hear about people who won't go to Israel, because of the Netanyahu government, and I think, where do you live? Where have we just been? What does it mean to go to the store and buy orange juice here in the United States, living under the Trump-McConnell regime? But there's a way in which equating all Jews and even equating all Israelis is understood to be valid in a way that equating all Americans with our government would simply never happen. And so I want to just lift up the work of Jill Jacobs, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, our friend and colleague here, because I think that some of what she's been writing about differentiating between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is really critical. She wrote a piece a couple of years ago in the Washington Post. Maybe you can share the link for it here, but it's a really important reminder for us that she identifies 5 ways of differentiating between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So let me just quickly share what they are. And again, this is the work of Jill Jacobs. She says, assuming that any one Jew speaks for all Jews, or that the Israeli government speaks for all Jews, is a form of anti-Semitism. Let me add that tendency has been exacerbated by Bibi himself saying that he is the spokesperson of the Jewish people, by Donald Trump addressing Jewish Americans, saying your country and your prime minister, that the blending of the kind of lack of care in the way that we use language definitely exacerbates that tendency. Number 2, she says, seeing Jews as insidious influencers behind the scenes of world events, that is not anti-Zionism, not just anti-Zionism, but that's actually anti-Semitism. And I have seen this among people who point to what's happening in Israeli policy as an expression of Jews controlling the world the same way that we see in these broader conspiracy theories. Third, very quickly, using the word Zionist as a code for Jew or Israeli. Like, you'll see that people refuse to actually use the word Israeli or even Jew, that we are all Zionist because you're wearing a Jewish star, because you're going into a Shabbos dinner or wearing going to a synagogue. 4, she says, is denying Jewish history, and 5 is dismissing the humanity of Israelis. That all of these things are expressions not just of anti-Zionism or of criticism of Israeli policy, but are actually expressions of anti-Semitism. And I think it's really important that we get really clear on what those things are, and even on what anti-Semitism means, because it's not just non-Jews who have to be educated on and called to interrogate their internalized anti-Semitism, but also we in the Jewish community have a lot of work to do in order to understand anti-Semitism and see the ways that we might actually be playing with some of the very tropes that are so damaging and so dangerous to us on the broader stage.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thank you also for bringing in Rabbi Jill Jacobs' voice, who's a trusted and really vital partner in the work that we're doing. I want to transition now to our Q&A. We've gotten so many questions in the chat box, and I want to start it by bringing in a voice from the college campus, actually from my alma mater, Brown University. Eliana Blumberg is a freshman at Brown and chapter president of J Street U. And Eliana, I'm hoping will give us a snapshot about how this discourse is actually playing out on the college campus. So Eliana, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So like I said, I'm a freshman at Brown and we're doing a summer semester right now. So we've sort of been in the thick of school right now, which has been really interesting because we've seen the way Hillel has been handling this and the way students have been reacting. Just a little disclaimer, so social media has played an enormous role in how students are experiencing this. And at the beginning of the semester, I deleted all of my social media because it was such a time suck. So it's totally shaped the way that I've experienced this, for better or for worse, don't really know, but just saying I can't really speak on the social media part. But I would say that on campus, there's been this sort of visible confusion among Jewish students. The usual questioning that occurs when students enter college, when they're away from the Jewish environment that they grew up in and are allowed to really question the narratives that they were fed and the beliefs they had, mostly because probably the people around them were doing the things and thinking the things. And that's been magnified by this. I think that there's this need, sort of collective need to unpack and to discuss, but also this fear of making statements because people feel like they don't have enough information. They feel like if they say something wrong, they'll get canceled for it, which there was this one group chat of like 2,000 people where someone was like defending Israel and got kicked out of the group chat, which caused obviously was very bad and caused some controversy. But there has also been a lot of tension between students and Hillel, which at Brown doesn't happen very frequently. I think that Brown University Hillel does a really, really good job usually of really making an effort to support all of its students. And I really feel for them right now. It's really tough time to attempt to do that, but they're really not doing that right now. The support that we're seeing from Hillel, and I think this is true across all campuses, is that really the only people who are getting space are the people who are feeling immediately threatened by anti-Semitism. What that anti-Semitism is a little unclear. I think I've had conversations with some of my friends who don't really know what's anti-Semitic and what's not. We'll see a text go out to a group chat about an SJP protest and something doesn't feel right and they think, oh, this must be anti-Semitic. But whether it actually is anti-Semitic or whether, like I said before, it's just this sort of narrative that they've been fed that certain organizations, everything that they put out will be anti-Semitic. So that's another element of it. But
Eliana, thank you so much for sharing that vantage point from campus. I know that experience that you're having is actually one that's not unique to students alone, but actually a lot of folks in the community are grappling with really similar questions. And I want to also have an opportunity to bring in voices from our listeners, some of which are really directly responding to what you just mentioned. And there's a few questions that have come in about the New York Times. Some of us saw that recently the New York Times ran above the fold a story about children who were killed in this conflict in Gaza and also in Israel. And there were really powerful folks who held positions of leadership and influence in our community who described that act of reporting on the lives lost in the military escalation in Gaza as anti-Semitic, as a blood libel. And I wanted to turn to Nancy and Sharon to just address that. Like, how do we navigate the sort of boundaries of what we can extend our humanity to consider? How do we deal with the defensiveness or the sense that a focus on the stories of Gazans who have died, in addition to Israelis who have died, is in itself an act of anti-Semitism? And what does that do to our discourse in our community?
Sharon, why don't you start and then I'll share.
Look, I think we have two choices when you're a Jew in America and you get your New York Times and open it up in the morning and you see those pictures. Either you sit down and you read every single word and you look into the faces of every single one of those children, all of whom should be alive today, who look a lot like my son and my nephews and nieces in Israel, who actually look like cousins, right? And you grieve and you say, this must end. Or you say the New York Times is anti-Semitic, right? And the fact is that 68, I think it is now, 68 children under the age of 18 were killed, including 2 Israelis and 66 Palestinian children. If the Jewish heart is not big enough to break when we read the devastating stories of those children, then we have completely abandoned our inheritance, our sacred inheritance. And I can give you 1,000 examples from Torah of the ways in which we are called to cultivate a heart that can be present to and receive the suffering, not only of children, innocent children, many of whom died in their pajamas. They ran into the living room when they would hear the sounds of the bombs coming in, of the missiles coming in, not because they had bomb shelters there, but so that they would all die together because they couldn't bear to be survivors. If our hearts can't even hold that, then who are we as a people? And our tradition tells us not only that we need to have compassion and empathy and be devastated over that, but even over the people who are shooting the rockets, we're told we're supposed to be empathic toward. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. One, everyone famously knows the Midrash of when the Egyptians are drowning in the sea. This is the army of Egypt that's coming after and pursuing the formerly enslaved people of Israel. And when they drown and the angels start to dance and God says, how dare you? My children are still dying. I know this is really hard and really painful for us, but why is that Midrash told? Why does our tradition tell us that we grieve the death of the Egyptians even in the sea? And 2, I just want to ask us to think for a minute about the shofar, this iconic sound, right? This is like the ultimate Jewish symbol. And some of you know the origin of the story of why we blast 100 times on Rosh Hashanah. But for those who don't, I beg you to think about this for a moment. The Song of Deborah, one of the oldest biblical texts in our tradition, Deborah, who's a prophet and a judge of Israel. And so here's what happens. Sisera, the commander who ruthlessly oppresses Israel for 20 years, Israel rises up to challenge Sisera in battle. And Yael, this hero, goes out and she's able to conquer Sisera. She gets him drunk. She stabs him with a tent peg. It's like this incredible act of violent revenge. And the story should end there, but it doesn't, because in the Song of Deborah, Deborah calls to the mother of Sisera, the mother of our enemy who oppressed us for 20 years. And she imagines Sisera's own mother gazing through the lattice saying, where's my child? Why is his chariot so long in coming home? Think about what that means for us, that our tradition demands of us that the Jewish heart is capacious enough to understand the complexities of conflict and the need to defend ourselves and to break when people die, even if they're people on the other side of the border, and how much the more so when they're children. How dare we accuse the New York Times of anti-Semitism when they dare to show us the faces of the children who died in this round of conflict? Has our heart so collapsed that we cannot hold the truth of the matter that Israel has a right and an obligation to defend its people and its borders when Hamas rockets are coming in, and nevertheless killed 66 or 67 children on the other side of that border in our retaliation? And how dare we not ask, why was Hamas shooting those rockets in the first place? And what can and must we do in order to address root causes so that this conflict does not continue to erupt and escalate every couple of years until my nephews and nieces in Renana are old enough to watch their own children have to go to war to fight the same kind of battles? How dare we? And who are we? Who have we actually become?
Amen. I agree with everything Sharon said, and I would just say what it does for me is just makes me more determined that we must end the conflict. We must end it. There's no solution. There is no military solution, period. That's it. Doesn't make me an anti-Semite, doesn't make me a hater of, I don't like Hamas. They're a terrorist organization. But as Sharon said, these were children. They were children. I mean, period.
Well, I want to thank you both for bringing in this humanity and this ability to hold multiple truths at once. I want to ask you both as we close to reflect on everything that you've shared so far, to look forward and to ask, where do we go from here as a community? If you could put it into a few words, what is it that our Jewish community, and especially those who hold positions of leadership in our community, what is your message to them? Where should we go from here?
Let me start and just say that we're still waiting to hear whether we have a new government in Israel. We don't have a new government in Israel. I've been editing a book for a dear colleague who's part of the Adaptive Leadership Network that I'm part of, and she grew up in South Africa, and she's writing a book about Mandela, about leadership. And I keep reflecting on the lack of leadership, the lack of leadership, the lack of leadership in Israel, the lack of leadership among the Palestinians, really enlightened leadership. And when you think about Mandela and that, he could forgive after 27 years in prison, he could forgive, then, it still gives me hope. I think as a Jewish community, we have to stop pointing fingers, labeling, accusing, demeaning, defaming each other. We have to. And we have to look at the situation and say, it is not sustainable. If we care deeply, as I do, about preserving a Jewish democratic state, and I'm still there, then we have two choices. One, we can be a democratic state and not be a Jewish state if we don't preserve two states, or two, we can be a Jewish state and rule over another people, which to me is not a Jewish state. So that's it. That's the choice. And I think, I think that, organizations like Encounter, which I've done several times, have really changed, has really instilled in me a sense of people, what people are saying, not the leaders. I used to take non-Jews to Israel and meet with the Palestinian Authority leaders, and you'd hear the party line. But when you meet with people, and whether they're children who are killed in Gaza or in Israel, or on the ground, or women trying to organize solar panels in an Arab village in the West Bank, and they have them destroyed by the IDF. I mean, these are all real stories, right? How can we look at this? I just don't understand how we as a Jew, who 72% of us believe that we, essential to our Jewish identity is leading a moral and ethical life, that we don't believe that all people need to have to lead a moral and ethical life. So how do we lead? and how are we going to lead? And I think that's what we have to be able to say. We have to keep the two, we have to be able to hold all these truths in one place.
Thank you,
So,
Nancy, for offering that centering of humanity and human stories and of the stark question and choice that we face as a community. Sharon, I want to offer you the last words of where we go from here as a community.
Yeah, I feel like this is, I want to just be really clear about part of what Eliana was describing earlier about the dynamic on college campuses, and part of what we're all seeing on social media right now is part of it's just really unfair and really hard, and it's and heartbreaking, and part of it is the result of many years of our established Jewish community creating a moral vacuum when it comes to discussing the state of Israel, the policies of the state of Israel, and the Israel-Palestine conflict. We have chosen to take ourselves out of the role of moral leadership on this question. And as a result, a vacuum's been created in which the orthodoxy of this side matches the extremism of the orthodoxy on this side. And you've got pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, and everyone's screaming at each other across from the federal building on Wilshire on Sunday morning. And nobody learns that way. You've got people posting on TikTok and then people opposing on TikTok. Like, nobody is learning or growing that way. And it frankly does not serve the people of Israel or Palestine. It does not serve anybody. And so this is where I think the work of J Street has been so critical, and where I really want to lift up the work of New Israel Fund and many of the grantees on the ground there. Like Omdim Biachad, which I've been following. By the way, I'm really only on social media now to look at Omdim Biachad posts over the course of the last couple of weeks, because especially in the face of the mixed city violence, these are Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians on the other side of the Green Line who are standing together, arm in arm, saying the only way out of this is together. We must build a shared society together, and taking the moral mantle of this conflict into the streets. So this is the work that has to be done in this time. And I quoted in my Shabbat sermon last week something that Amos Oz writes about the order of the teaspoon, where he says that when you see a conflagration, you can either add fuel to the fire, or you can run away from the fire, or you can take water and put out that fire. And say you don't have a hose, then you use a bucket. And you don't have a bucket, then you use a cup. And if you don't have a cup, you use a spoon. And say all you have is a teaspoon, a tiny little teaspoon. You take your teaspoon of water and you use that to put out the fire. And he says, I want to create an order of the teaspoon. The good people from around the world who actually believe that it's our job to work together to put out the conflagration rather than adding fuel to it. I think that's the work right now. I think we have to say no to the moral vacuum. I'm not going to contribute to it anymore. I'm going to, each and every single one of us using our platforms as rabbis, as communal leaders, as teachers in Jewish day schools, and saying, I'm not going to share one side of a narrative alone anymore. This is a conflict of two traumatized people, both of whom have claim to the same small sliver of land, both of whom deserve to live in dignity in a just society. And the only way that we're going to get there is when we reject the extremes of these camps and we actually become part of the order of the teaspoon. Each of us doing whatever we can to make space for the narratives of both of these sides of this conflict, each of us doing whatever we can to amplify and to lift up the voices of the people on the ground who are doing the really critical work, and to refuse the binaries. This is a moment of rejection of binaries. I mean, we're seeing it in all ways in our society. It has to apply here too. A rejection of this camp and instead really the creation of and the sustaining of, through our funding and platforming and support of the people who are unwilling to go into either camp, and actually building, as Stav Shafir called, a coalition of the sane. People who are really ready to work together to build a shared future that is just and that is equitable and that is fair for everybody who lives in that land.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Brous, for that really inspiring invocation into the order of the teaspoon. I feel like all of us have marching orders from both of you to be part of building something shared that centers the humanity of all of the people who are involved with this conflict and who deserve a just and equal future. I've learned so much from you. I just want to thank you both for sharing so soulfully and with so much depth about the moment we find ourselves in. And I hope that for the many hundreds of people who are listening on this call, that you will continue to think about everything that Nancy and Rabbi Sharon Brous shared with us today. I certainly will be thinking about that for the days and weeks ahead. So thank you all for joining us for this webinar. Shane, I don't know if you want to offer any closing words, but it was a real pleasure to be with you today.
No, I'll just add my thanks. And this is just one of many conversations that we will be continuing to have at J Street with the Progressive Israel Network and with other colleagues. So thank you, and wishing you all a good afternoon. And thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Shane. Nice. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.